Rain swept across the long avenue leading to Blackthorne Hall, turning the ancient oaks into dark silhouettes that bowed beneath the restless wind. Carriages arrived one after another, their polished wheels hissing over soaked gravel while liveried footmen hurried beneath black umbrellas. Inside the sprawling manor, chandeliers scattered warm light across marble floors, crystal glasses shimmered upon silver trays, and a string quartet filled the air with restrained elegance. Everything had been prepared for the wedding that London society had discussed for months. Every noble guest expected to witness the union of wealth, lineage, and ambition. Instead, before the chapel bells had finished their first solemn peal, whispers began spreading through the assembled company like smoke finding every hidden corner. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, celebrated for her remarkable beauty and carefully negotiated fortune, had vanished before dawn. Her bed remained untouched, her jewels gone, and only a brief letter rested upon her dressing table. The servants dared not reveal its contents, but gossip required no evidence to flourish. Within minutes, ladies concealed astonishment behind painted fans while gentlemen exchanged knowing glances. Some declared the young woman had fled with a cavalry officer. Others insisted she had sailed for France. No version sounded impossible, for scandal always appeared more believable than virtue among those who lived upon appearances. At precisely 11 o'clock another carriage rolled through the iron gates. It lacked the polished grandeur of the earlier arrivals, its paint dulled by years of rain and neglect. A single passenger stepped carefully onto the wet stones. Eleanor Ashcombe gathered her plain grey skirts before the mud could stain them further. She wore no diamonds, no embroidered lace, no triumphant smile expected of a bride. Only a modest bonnet framed features softened by quiet sadness rather than fashionable confidence. She paused beneath the relentless rain, clutching a worn leather satchel instead of a bridal bouquet, while dozens of curious eyes fixed themselves upon her uncertain figure. Conversations stopped altogether. "That cannot possibly be the bride," someone murmured. Another voice answered with cruel amusement. "No. It is merely the forgotten sister." Eleanor heard every syllable. She had spent years becoming invisible within her father's household, learning that silence often earned fewer wounds than protest. Since childhood she had occupied the smaller rooms, worn altered gowns discarded by Beatrice, and accepted introductions as though she were little more than an afterthought attached to a distinguished family. Her late mother's portraits had quietly disappeared from the walls, replaced by newer paintings celebrating the second marriage that produced the dazzling daughter society adored. Eleanor carried no resentment grand enough for speeches. Only a familiar ache settled gently inside her whenever strangers confirmed what home had taught her to believe. The family solicitor hurried toward her with visible distress. "Miss Ashcombe," he whispered urgently, his lordship insisted someone present the explanation personally. "Your father has fallen ill with embarrassment and remains inside." She lowered her gaze. "I did not come willingly." "I know. They required someone to face his grace." The elderly man closed his eyes briefly, unable to deny it. Beyond the entrance, Duke Adrian Blackthorne stood beside the chapel doors, tall and motionless in formal black attire that reflected neither celebration nor disappointment. His reputation had long preceded him through drawing rooms and parliamentary dinners alike. Widowed by circumstance rather than marriage, reserved beyond comfort, and disciplined almost to severity, he inspired respect without inviting affection. Many believed his heart had been fashioned from the same cold stone as the ancestral fortress bearing his family name. Those closest to him understood only that duty governed every decision he made. When Eleanor finally lifted her eyes, their gazes met across the crowded hall. She expected anger, perhaps humiliation, perhaps immediate dismissal. Instead she found only careful observation. Adrian studied the trembling woman before him with unusual patience, noticing details everyone else ignored. Rainwater clung to loose strands of chestnut hair escaping beneath her bonnet. Her gloves had been mended several times by delicate hands determined to preserve what little remained. Though frightened beyond measure, she greeted every servant she passed with grateful courtesy, offering apologies whenever someone adjusted her cloak. Nothing about her resembled calculated deception. Everything suggested a person accustomed to carrying burdens that belonged to others. The Ashcombe patriarch approached, pale beneath his powdered wig. "Your Grace," he began shakily, "an unfortunate misunderstanding has occurred. My younger daughter departed unexpectedly. Until she returns, Eleanor has come merely to express our deepest regrets." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the guests. One lady whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Imagine sending the spare daughter as though exchanging damaged china." Color drained from Eleanor's face. She stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Your Grace," she said with flawless courtesy despite her trembling voice, "I ask neither forgiveness nor consideration. I regret only that your household has been burdened by my family's disgrace. If you permit, I shall leave immediately and trouble you no further." Silence answered her. Even the rain seemed to hesitate beyond the stained glass windows. Adrian descended the chapel steps slowly until only a single pace separated them. Every aristocrat leaned forward, anticipating the rejection that custom demanded. Instead, he removed one immaculate glove, offered his hand, and spoke with calm clarity that carried through the entire hall. "The mistake before us," he said, never looking away from Eleanor's astonished eyes, "is not the lady. It is every soul who convinced her she must apologize for existing. Miss Ashcombe, remain. We shall discover the truth together." No one dared breathe, yet every certainty inside Blackthorne Hall had already begun to unravel. The astonished silence lingered long after the chapel emptied, clinging to Blackthorne Hall more stubbornly than the rain that continued washing against its towering windows. Guests departed carrying fresh gossip instead of cherished wedding memories, while servants exchanged bewildered glances in corridors usually governed by perfect discretion. Eleanor expected that the Duke's unexpected kindness would vanish with the last departing carriage. Surely, once dignity had been restored before witnesses, she would be quietly escorted away. Yet no dismissal arrived. Instead, Adrian instructed the housekeeper to prepare the east guest chamber, overlooking the gardens, until the circumstances surrounding Lady Beatrice's disappearance could be properly investigated. Eleanor followed the elderly housekeeper through endless corridors adorned with portraits whose solemn eyes seemed to measure every uncertain footstep. Heavy velvet draperies softened the afternoon light, while polished oak floors reflected the glow of countless lamps. Every chamber spoke of generations devoted to preserving order, tradition, and quiet grandeur. She felt painfully out of place among such magnificence, carrying only her worn satchel and the lifelong habit of making herself as small as possible. Even her breathing seemed an intrusion upon the house's disciplined rhythm. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose silver hair was arranged with impeccable precision, opened the chamber door without unnecessary ceremony. "This room receives the morning sun," she said gently. "His Grace thought the light might prove comforting." Eleanor blinked with surprise. "He selected the room himself." The older woman offered only the faintest smile. "His Grace notices more than people imagine." When Eleanor found herself alone, she stood before the tall windows overlooking the neglected winter garden. Ivy-strangled marble statues, empty flowerbeds disappeared beneath weeds, and broken fountains collected rainwater instead of music. Despite its decay, the forgotten sanctuary possessed a quiet grace that stirred something familiar inside her heart. She remembered sketching abandoned gardens as a child because neglected beauty always seemed to understand her better than polished perfection. Resting her fingertips against the cool glass, she whispered almost unconsciously, "You only needed someone to remember you." Unbeknownst to her, Adrian crossed the courtyard below at that very moment. He glanced upward and saw her gazing toward the abandoned garden rather than the grand lawns beyond. He followed the direction of her attention, then quietly summoned the head gardener before continuing his walk without explanation. The following morning, Eleanor awakened to the rhythmic sound of shovels striking earth. Curious, she approached the window and froze. Half a dozen gardeners labored beneath the pale autumn sky, trimming dead vines, repairing cracked pathways, and carefully lifting dormant rose bushes from choking weeds. The broken fountain had already been drained, while carts overflowing with fresh soil waited beside the marble gate. Nothing in the estate moved carelessly. Every gesture suggested deliberate purpose. A young maid entered carrying breakfast. "Oh," she exclaimed brightly, noticing Eleanor's astonishment, "they began before sunrise." "Who ordered such work?" The maid hesitated. "I was not told, miss." Upon the breakfast tray rested a folded card. No signature appeared beneath the elegant handwriting. Only a single sentence. "Beauty deserves witnesses." Eleanor read the words twice before carefully placing the note inside her satchel beside her sketchbook. No one had ever offered her kindness without expecting repayment. She struggled to believe the message could possibly concern either the garden or herself. Days settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. Adrian remained occupied with estate affairs, tenant meetings, and correspondence concerning Beatrice's disappearance, yet their paths crossed often enough to unsettle Eleanor's guarded expectations. At breakfast he greeted every servant by name. During evening walks he paused to admire ancient trees rather than discussing politics. He possessed the commanding presence of a man accustomed to obedience, yet spoke quietly enough that people leaned closer instead of shrinking away. Beneath his disciplined reserve lived an attentiveness she had never associated with power. Meanwhile, London discovered fresh amusement. Newspapers eagerly transformed the abandoned wedding into fashionable entertainment. Anonymous columnists suggested Eleanor had manipulated her timid appearance to ensnare an unsuspecting duke. Invitations ceased arriving for Blackthorne Hall, while neighboring ladies invented elaborate theories explaining why Adrian refused to send his unexpected guest away. Some pitied him. Others mocked him. None imagined compassion could exist without hidden motives. One damp afternoon Eleanor accompanied Mrs. Hargreaves through the village to distribute blankets before winter's arrival. Outside the church, two elegantly dressed women paused beside their carriage. "So that is the substitute bride," one remarked. "I expected someone prettier." The other laughed softly. "His Grace must possess extraordinary patience." Eleanor lowered her eyes and continued walking, determined not to reward cruelty with visible pain. When she returned, Adrian was waiting beneath the covered entrance. "You are late," he observed. "I wish to avoid troubling your reputation further." "My reputation has survived Parliament." She attempted a faint smile. "The newspapers are less forgiving." He regarded her steadily before answering. "Newspapers sell certainty. And truth. Truth rarely arrives before the final edition." His quiet confidence eased something inside her she had not realized remained tightly bound. As autumn deepened, the winter garden slowly awakened beneath careful hands. Stone benches emerged from ivy. Lavender-bordered restored pathways. The repaired fountain finally carried clear water beneath pale afternoon sunlight. Eleanor visited often with her sketchbook, filling page after page with blossoms not yet fully opened. She believed herself unobserved until one chilly evening Adrian found her sitting beside the fountain feeding crumbs to a gathering of timid robins. "You always feed the smallest birds first," he remarked. She looked up, embarrassed. "They wait longer because stronger ones frighten them away." "So you noticed." "I know something of waiting." The words escaped before she could restrain them. He stepped beside the bench. "So do I." Silence settled comfortably between them. After several thoughtful moments, he spoke again. "Miss Ashcombe." "Yes, Your Grace." "No one should apologize for occupying the space heaven granted them." The sentence entered her heart with startling gentleness. She turned away quickly, fearing gratitude might dissolve into tears before him. Adrian pretended not to notice, allowing dignity to remain where emotion threatened to overwhelm it. That night, after moonlight silvered the silent corridors and every candle burned low, Eleanor returned to her chamber expecting only solitude. Instead, resting upon the polished dressing table beside her modest hairbrush lay an antique sapphire necklace bearing the unmistakable crest of Blackthorne. There was no accompanying explanation, no servant waiting outside, no signature beneath the velvet box. Only the glittering heirloom reflected the trembling uncertainty in her eyes, leaving her to wonder whether the house itself had begun quietly choosing its future mistress. Morning light poured through the towering windows of Blackthorne Hall, illuminating the sapphire necklace with quiet brilliance as Eleanor stood uncertain before her dressing table. She had spent the night wondering whether the heirloom had been delivered by mistake, yet every inquiry met gentle confusion. Mrs. Hargreaves insisted no servant admitted entering the chamber after supper. The footman knew nothing. Even the housemaids exchanged puzzled glances. The mystery lingered like a whispered promise, impossible to dismiss yet equally impossible to explain. Rather than wearing the jewels, Eleanor carefully returned them to their velvet case, fearing she possessed no rightful claim to treasures carried through generations of noble history. When Adrian encountered her in the library that afternoon, his gaze rested briefly upon the unopened case tucked beneath her arm. "You did not wear it." She lowered her eyes. "I believed it wiser not to presume." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Some gifts ask only to be accepted, and some become burdens if accepted too readily. He inclined his head with quiet respect, recognizing caution shaped by years of disappointment rather than ingratitude. Neither mentioned the necklace again, yet something unspoken settled comfortably between them, replacing awkward obligation with growing understanding. The days that followed unfolded with surprising gentleness. Adrian began inviting Eleanor to accompany him during ordinary estate duties rather than formal entertainments. Together they inspected tenant cottages recovering from autumn storms, visited the village school where children greeted the Duke with fearless affection, and spent quiet afternoons within the vast library cataloguing fragile manuscripts inherited from distant ancestors. Eleanor discovered that beneath Adrian's disciplined exterior lived an observant man who valued thoughtful conversation above polished flattery. He listened without interruption whenever she spoke about books, gardens, or painting, treating every opinion as though it deserved careful consideration. No one had ever granted her such patient attention. The household noticed these quiet changes before either of them did. Servants instinctively placed a second teacup beside Adrian's chair whenever Eleanor entered the drawing room. The stable master prepared 2 horses instead of 1 before morning rides. During dinner, conversations paused naturally until Miss Ashcombe had taken her seat, not from obligation but genuine regard. Even Mrs. Hargreaves occasionally caught herself referring to Eleanor as "my lady" before smiling apologetically. Rather than correcting the harmless mistake, Adrian merely continued eating, his silence carrying more meaning than any declaration. Outside the estate, however, society sharpened its appetite for scandal. Invitations arrived for Blackthorne Hall bearing polite requests that Eleanor remain absent from fashionable gatherings. Anonymous pamphlets mocked the mysterious woman who had occupied another lady's place beneath the Duke's roof. Every rumor insisted Adrian's kindness concealed secret ambition or reckless infatuation. Eleanor read none of the printed accusations, yet fragments reached her ears through careless visitors and passing conversations. She feared becoming the shadow permanently attached to his honorable name. Winter announced itself with the season's grandest ball, hosted annually by the Blackthorne family. Crystal chandeliers blazed above polished floors while musicians tuned their instruments beneath towering garlands of evergreen and white roses. Coaches crowded the entrance from dusk until moonrise, delivering dukes, earls, ambassadors, and celebrated beauties dressed in silks shimmering like fresh snowfall. Eleanor begged permission to remain upstairs, convinced her presence would provoke unnecessary spectacle. Adrian refused gently. "You have hidden from enough rooms. They expect your future duchess. They shall meet my honored guest." She hesitated. "That distinction will satisfy no one." "It satisfies me." Mrs. Hargreaves fastened the sapphire necklace around Eleanor's neck before she descended the sweeping staircase. The deep blue stones reflected candlelight like fragments of midnight sky, transforming her simple ivory gown into quiet elegance. Conversations faltered the moment she entered the ballroom upon Adrian's arm. Curious eyes lingered upon the heirloom every Blackthorne child recognized from ancestral portraits. Gasps spread almost as quickly as the music resumed. Eleanor wished desperately to disappear, yet Adrian neither hurried nor apologized. He walked beside her with calm assurance, acknowledging every greeting while ignoring every whispered judgment. Hours passed beneath glittering ceilings as noble couples danced graceful figures across the polished floor. Eleanor remained near the edge of the ballroom, grateful simply to observe. Then the orchestra concluded one lively waltz, and Adrian crossed the crowded room directly toward her. Every surrounding conversation faded into expectant silence. He bowed. "Miss Ashcombe, may I claim this dance?" She stared at him, startled. "Your Grace, everyone is watching." "Then let them witness kindness." His voice carried no challenge, only quiet conviction. Trembling slightly, she accepted his offered hand. The orchestra resumed. They moved together with measured elegance, neither hurried nor hesitant. Adrian guided her effortlessly through each graceful turn while murmurs rippled around the ballroom like restless tides. Eleanor gradually forgot the watching eyes, concentrating instead upon the reassuring steadiness of his hand and the remarkable gentleness hidden beneath disciplined strength. For the first time since childhood, she experienced the astonishing sensation of belonging somewhere without earning permission to exist. As the final notes faded, an elderly gentleman approached carrying a weathered leather portfolio embossed with the Blackthorne crest. He introduced himself as Mr. Pembroke, the family's oldest solicitor, recently returned after months abroad. Requesting Adrian's private attention, he produced several sealed documents discovered within forgotten estate archives. Among them rested a faded letter written decades earlier by the late Duke, expressing profound gratitude toward Eleanor's mother, whose courageous testimony had once prevented Blackthorne lands from being seized through fraudulent claims. The old Duke confessed his lifelong wish that one day the families might become united through genuine affection rather than calculated advantage. Adrian read every line in astonished silence before lifting his eyes toward Eleanor, who stood beneath generations of solemn ancestral portraits. His heart recognized a truth unfolding long before either of them had ever met, and he realized with quiet certainty that fate had arrived disguised as a dreadful mistake. The discovery hidden within the old solicitor's documents settled over Blackthorne Hall with the quiet gravity of destiny. Adrian spent the following morning alone in the portrait gallery, studying generations of solemn faces whose painted expressions seemed suddenly less distant. Among them hung the likeness of his late father, a man remembered for unwavering judgment rather than sentimental impulses. Until now Adrian had believed every important decision rested upon calculation alone. Yet the faded letter revealed gratitude powerful enough to outlive decades, quietly guiding events beyond the reach of ordinary intention. Eleanor had never been an accidental guest. In ways neither family fully understood, she had always belonged somewhere within the story of Blackthorne Hall. Eleanor remained unaware of the letter's contents. She sensed only that Adrian regarded her with deeper tenderness than before, a change both comforting and frightening. His gaze no longer carried simple compassion for an unwanted woman. Instead, it reflected admiration so sincere that she scarcely knew where to rest her eyes whenever they met. Such regard felt dangerous. Kindness could be accepted with gratitude, but love demanded a courage she had never imagined possessing. The fragile peace surrounding the estate ended 3 days later. A procession of elegant carriages arrived before noon, displaying the unmistakable Ashcombe crest upon polished doors. Servants exchanged uneasy glances as Eleanor's father emerged with rigid dignity, followed by Lady Beatrice herself, dressed in fashionable crimson velvet that announced confidence before she uttered a single word. Her disappearance had become London's favorite scandal. Her return promised something even greater. The drawing-room welcomed them beneath glittering chandeliers and carefully controlled silence. Lord Ashcombe wasted little time upon pleasantries. "Your Grace," he declared, "my younger daughter has returned to fulfill her original obligation. The unfortunate misunderstanding may now be corrected." Beatrice offered Adrian a graceful curtsy polished through years of admiration and expectation. "I deeply regret the confusion," she said smoothly. "Youth occasionally mistakes freedom for wisdom. I have reflected upon my responsibilities." Eleanor remained standing near the window, wishing herself invisible once more. Adrian answered calmly, "I am pleased Lady Beatrice is safe." Her smile brightened. "Then our engagement may proceed." "No." The single word struck the room with astonishing force. Lord Ashcombe stiffened. I beg your pardon. There is no engagement remaining. Beatrice laughed softly, convinced she had misunderstood. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious. Silence spread between them like winter frost. Lord Ashcombe's voice hardened. My younger daughter possesses the fortune, accomplishments, and connections originally negotiated between our families. Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. I am aware. Then what possible objection remains? The Duke reached into a nearby cabinet and withdrew the leather folder containing the original marriage agreement. Every eye followed the weathered document resting between his gloved hands. Without raising his voice, he broke the wax seal, unfolded the contract, and slowly tore every page into narrow strips that drifted toward the polished floor like fallen leaves. No one moved. No one breathed. The crackle of tearing parchment echoed through the magnificent chamber with unforgettable finality. A title, Adrian said quietly, may command obedience. It has never commanded my heart. Beatrice's composed expression fractured into disbelief. You would discard everything for her. He turned toward Eleanor. I would discard anything that asks me to betray what is honorable. Eleanor felt every gaze settle upon her with unbearable intensity. This is madness, Lord Ashcombe protested. No, Adrian replied. It is honesty. The older man approached Eleanor sharply. You have manipulated his grace with calculated humility. She flinched as though struck. I have done nothing. You have stolen your sister's future. Tears threatened, yet Eleanor forced herself to remain composed. I never wished for any of this. Adrian stepped between them before another accusation could fall. Enough. His voice remained calm, yet carried unmistakable authority. You will not speak to Miss Ashcombe in that manner beneath my roof. The confrontation ended only when Lord Ashcombe gathered his furious daughter and departed with cold promises that society would never forgive such humiliation. Their departing carriages vanished through falling snow, leaving Blackthorne Hall wrapped in profound stillness. That evening Eleanor wandered alone into the restored winter garden. Snowflakes settled gently upon blooming hellebores, transforming every flower into delicate sculpture beneath the moonlight. The fountain continued flowing despite the cold, its quiet music mingling with the whispering wind. She scarcely noticed Adrian approaching until he stopped beside the marble bench where they had first spoken about frightened birds. You should not have defended me, she whispered. I defended the truth. The truth will cost you dearly. I have paid greater prices for lesser causes. She closed her eyes briefly. Your Grace, society will never forget today. I hope not. She looked at him with quiet desperation. You deserve someone magnificent. A gentle smile touched his face. I searched every ballroom for magnificence. He paused before continuing. I found it only in kindness. Her carefully guarded composure finally broke. Tears shimmered beneath the winter moon as years of rejection collided with words she had never expected to hear. I cannot allow you to sacrifice your future. You are not my sacrifice. I will become your scandal. You have become my peace. The simplicity of his confession carried greater force than grand declarations ever could. Slowly, he removed a small velvet ring box from his coat. There is only one question I wish to ask. Before he could continue, Eleanor stepped backward. No. The word escaped through trembling sorrow rather than certainty. Adrian remained still. I love you too deeply to destroy everything your family has built. He searched her face, recognizing that every refusal sprang from devotion instead of fear. I ask for nothing except the chance to choose. You already have. She offered him one heartbreaking smile. And you deserve the freedom to choose better. Leaving the untouched ring within his outstretched hand, Eleanor turned away before her courage abandoned her completely. Adrian watched her disappear through the snow-covered arches without attempting to stop her, understanding that love restrained by honor could wound more deeply than love denied altogether. Yet as the garden gates closed behind her, Mrs. Hargreaves emerged from the shadows holding a sealed letter recently delivered by special courier. The elegant handwriting upon the envelope belonged unmistakably to Lady Beatrice, and the housekeeper's troubled expression suggested the vanished bride had one final secret capable of changing every certainty once again. Mrs. Hargreaves carried the sealed letter directly to Adrian, her careful composure unable to disguise the concern in her eyes. He broke the wax seal beside the dying fire in the library, expecting another plea from Beatrice to restore the broken arrangement. Instead, he discovered a confession written with startling honesty. Beatrice admitted she had never loved him and had fled because she intended to marry the cavalry officer whose name society had guessed but never proven. She confessed that Eleanor had begged their father not to send her in the bride's place, offering to disappear quietly rather than deepen the family's disgrace. Lord Ashcombe had ignored every protest, insisting that one daughter's dignity mattered less than preserving the family's reputation. The final lines carried unexpected remorse. She has spent her life paying for faults that were never hers. If anyone deserves happiness, it is Eleanor. Do not allow my cowardice to become her punishment. Adrian folded the letter slowly, his heart aching not for the failed engagement but for the years of silent injustice Eleanor had endured. He immediately searched the guest chamber, intending to place the letter into her hands so she would finally know the truth. The room was immaculate. The sapphire necklace rested carefully inside its velvet box. Her sketchbook was gone. Beside the window overlooking the restored winter garden lay a single envelope addressed in graceful handwriting. He opened it with trembling fingers. "My dear Your Grace, I cannot remain where every kindness you show me becomes another burden upon your honorable name. Loving you has taught me my own worth, yet that very lesson requires me to leave before affection destroys everything you have inherited. Thank you for seeing a woman where others saw only a substitute. I shall treasure that gift beyond every remaining day of my life. Please do not search for me. Remember me kindly, and choose a future untouched by scandal. Eleanor." Before the ink had fully dried in his thoughts, Adrian ordered his horse prepared. For weeks he searched across neighboring counties, visiting every village where Eleanor might have found quiet employment. He questioned innkeepers, clergymen, schoolmistresses, and gardeners, never revealing desperation yet carrying it unmistakably within his weary eyes. Winter surrendered slowly to early spring as roads softened beneath melting frost. Rumors replaced certainty. Some believed she had traveled abroad. Others insisted she had entered a convent. Adrian refused every comforting assumption. He knew Eleanor too well. She would choose usefulness over escape, purpose over self-pity, and service over safety. One rainy afternoon an elderly vicar recognized the small portrait Adrian carried inside his coat. "I have seen that young lady," the old man said thoughtfully. "She teaches reading to orphan children in Ashcroft village, several miles beyond the eastern hills." Adrian thanked him with quiet urgency and rode without delay. Ashcroft proved little more than a cluster of stone cottages gathered around an aging chapel. Children's laughter drifted from a modest schoolhouse whose windows stood open to welcome the gentle breeze of approaching spring. Adrian paused outside before entering, suddenly aware that courage felt different when one's future depended upon another heart. Inside, Eleanor knelt beside a little girl struggling to form careful letters upon a slate. Her plain blue dress carried traces of chalk, and loose strands of chestnut hair framed a face calmer than he had ever seen it. She looked smaller without the grandeur of Blackthorne Hall surrounding her, yet somehow stronger, as though quiet purpose had become its own form of nobility. One child noticed the visitor first. "Miss Eleanor," he whispered excitedly, "there is a gentleman." She turned. For a long moment neither moved. The children sensed something extraordinary unfolding and fell into instinctive silence. Adrian removed his gloves slowly before crossing the room. "I received your letter. I hoped you would obey it. I have never possessed much talent for obedience." Despite herself, she smiled through gathering tears. "You should not have come. I could not remain away." She searched his face, finding exhaustion where perfect composure had once lived. "You belong at Blackthorne Hall. My home has never been stone." The room seemed to disappear around them. It has always been wherever you are. Emotion overcame the careful restraint she had practiced throughout her life. I left because I loved you. I know. I believed love demanded sacrifice. It does. He stepped closer. But sacrifice should never belong to only one heart. Then, before astonished children and the elderly schoolmistress quietly watching from the doorway, Adrian lowered himself onto one knee. Not as the Duke of Blackthorne. Simply as a man. Eleanor Ashcombe, every road I followed ended where you stood. Every morning without you felt strangely unfinished. You once thanked me for seeing you. The truth is simpler. You taught me how to see it all. Will you come home with me, not because society approves, not because history expects it, but because I cannot imagine another future worthy of either of us? She covered her mouth as tears escaped freely. You still choose me. I have never chosen anyone else. The smallest girl tugged gently at Eleanor's sleeve. I think you should say yes, she whispered with innocent certainty. Soft laughter filled the little classroom. Eleanor extended trembling hands toward Adrian. Then I shall stop running. He slipped the waiting ring upon her finger, rose to his feet, and gathered her into an embrace filled not with triumph but profound relief. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later within the small chapel at Blackthorne Hall, attended not by London's loudest voices but by those who had witnessed quiet goodness with their own eyes. The restored winter garden bloomed in radiant color beyond the chapel windows, every pathway alive with roses, lavender, and white blossoms that had once seemed beyond saving. Mrs. Hargreaves wept openly. The village children scattered flower petals instead of aristocratic pages. Even Beatrice attended quietly, offering Eleanor a sincere apology that required no audience to possess meaning. Years passed, and history continued recording parliamentary speeches, noble titles, and prosperous estates, yet the people living around Blackthorne remembered something entirely different. They remembered a duchess who knew every servant by name, opened schools for forgotten children, restored neglected gardens, and greeted strangers with the same gentle dignity she had once struggled to grant herself. Visitors often paused before a marble bench in the winter garden where a simple inscription had been carved at Adrian's request. She believed herself forgotten until love taught her she had always been worthy of remembrance. Whenever spring returned and the first flowers opened beneath warm sunlight, the Duke would quietly take Eleanor's hand, grateful that the bride who never arrived had led him instead to the woman he could never have lived without.